everyone, I'm Ishika.
And I'm Akshay.
The thing about wildlife is anyone can fall in love with it through science, photography, literature, or innocent observation. Sharing this love with us today, we have with us Veena Kapoor from the Nature Conservation Foundation. Veena is a scientist, conservationist, and educator who does far more than she freely admits. Without drawing any attention to herself, she quietly does meaningful work that benefits both wildlife and people of all age groups. Today, we are going to shine the spotlight on her and listen to what inspired her to give herself to this field and to learn about the experiences that have kept her going. So, thanks, Veena, for being here with us. We're really excited to speak to you. And since we've both known you in different capacities, it's especially exciting to get to know more of who is behind the scientist educator who is Veena. So, welcome.
Thank you, Ishika and Akshay, and it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Veena, for joining us on the podcast. So Veena, we decided that since you have such an interesting and varied life story, we can start from the beginning, right? So, fresh out of college, you studied commerce, which is again something unique to people who are interested in nature. You don't usually start off there, and then you changed your mind and you went back to school and studied wildlife formally in Pondicherry. So, tell us about that. What happened, and why did that shift happen in your life?
Yeah, so I finished my schooling in the mid, early 90s, and then and I didn't really have too many people, guiding me or helping me think about career paths. And there was nobody in my family or immediate circles who could actually tell me about, what paths I could take depending on my interests. And so after I finished studying commerce in my school in my 11th and 12th, I, like a lot of people, wanted to actually do veterinary sciences because I loved animals. And for most of us at that point of time, loving animals and growing up with them meant that you wanted to get into the veterinary sciences. But after my 10th, I realized that I just wasn't cut out for a science getting into a science subject, because I went to a traditional school, and it really was taught in an extremely traditional way. And so it was just not exciting at all. And I, at that point, didn't think I had the confidence to, continue in the science field. And so the other option, again, this is the 90s, remember, the other option was to do commerce. And so I just went into doing commerce and, studied that for 2 years. And that's after you finish your 12th, the only thing available to you again is to get into a BCom degree or an economics degree. And so I got admission into Ethraj College, which is a women's college, into the evening college program. And I grabbed that again without thinking too much. But that was, for me, in hindsight, very useful, because it was only 3 hours of college every day in the evening, which gave me a lot of time in the morning and afternoon to pursue other interests. And by this time, I started developing a keener interest in nature. I was trying to get hold of as many books or magazines I could find on wildlife. And so I was reading a lot about that. I was still not meeting people in the field. I would come across a few people, but, and I had conversations with them, but a lot of them were still doing voluntary work at that point of time. So I still didn't think of it seriously as a career path I could take. So it was still a very confusing kind of thing. So did the usual, getting into student, groups, some activism work as well. And during the morning and afternoon periods when I was free. In my third year of college, I was voted into the student union body. And that kind of gave me a little bit more of power, to say, to kind of influence a little bit in terms of how the college, would influence a little bit in terms of getting my college classmates to think about the environment, think about, engaging with nature. And so did small little things like, planting trees in the college background, because otherwise the college was just this concrete block of buildings. And I had one particular teacher who didn't teach me directly, but she was advising the student union body. She was an advisor to the student union body. She kind of encouraged me a lot. And when I finished my college and I told her, I really want to get into the wildlife and conservation kind of field, but I don't know anybody, she introduced me to these people who run this organization called Center for Indian Knowledge Systems. So they are based in Chennai, and she said they don't do wildlife and conservation, but they are instead trying to conserve traditional wild food varieties and seeds. And she said one of them also has been, kind of studying spiders, and she looked at spiders for her PhD thesis. And so I went and met them, and at that point in time, they were looking for somebody to help them collate a lot of information. So I finished my undergrad by this time, and after a few months, I joined the Center for Indian Knowledge Systems as a research assistant. And I was helping them put together some reports on the effects of pesticides on people, on humans, as well as on animals, and trying to gather information about that. So they were an organization who was also into a little bit of activism. And so that was very good for me to see, how some organizations work and the kind of approach they take. And also they were working with farming communities in and around Chennai area. So I would go with them on field trips, engage with the farming community over there. And so I think a lot of that kind of added up to my understanding of what it is to be in a field like situation. Because until then, remember, I didn't have any kind of idea of what that meant. So that, after about a year of helping them put together these research reports on pesticides and looking at alternate kind of methods, instead of using chemical pesticides on different farming types, they kind of discussed with me whether I would be interested in looking at using spiders potentially as biocontrol agents, as a substitute for chemical pesticides. And that meant, going into the field, doing experiments, trying it out. And so my first reaction was, but I don't know anything about spiders, and, I've not studied biology. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it. How will I even, how will I identify anything on the field? And so for me, I think this was a little bit of aha moment, because the person I worked with, Dr. Vijayalakshmi, she and Preston actually brought out the first book of common Indian spiders. This is again way back in the 90s. And she said, come, I'll take you and show you a few spiders. And we had a small little office in Tiruvamur area in Chennai. And I said, what do you mean you'll show me spiders? She said, yeah, we'll just go for a short walk around, and I'll show you at least 4 or 5 different types and see if you like seeing them. And I still remember this very vividly, that I think this must have been around 98 or 99. And she took me out, and in that small little garden that we had, she showed me at least 5-6 different spider species in a matter of like less than 10 minutes. And I was so excited when I saw this, because I was going to office every day, walking around in the garden in the afternoons, but I hadn't seen any of them. I hadn't looked at them. And then she started showing me this, and the first spider she showed me was a tent web spider. And architecturally, it's a beautiful web, which it's an architectural marvel, I think, the web that spider builds. It also had egg sacs in it. And so I was staring at it and looking at it and all. And so what really helped was, because she had done her PhD work on spiders, they had a lot of literature and books and papers on spiders. And at that point of time, slides of different spiders that they had documented in and around Chennai. And so we had a little slide projector. So I would, after that, because I was hooked, I would go into the office really early morning, different slides, and I would try and see if I can identify, spider species. And this is not the first time I'm even kind of trying to engage with, biological names So everything was new to me. So I remember repeating some of these species names to myself. And so I would say, oh, green-linked spider is this, that. So it was very much a self-learning kind of thing, which is why I think it really stuck to me, because nobody really taught me, but because I learned by myself and had access to all this literature and books. And so as part of this, I got an opportunity to look at spiders in Guindy National Park, which the Forest Department of Tamil Nadu at that point of time was interested. Now, Guindy National Park is unique, like Sanjay Gandhi National Park, in that it's like a national park within the city center. And so this kind of, again, opened up my eyes to the possibilities of just the crazy species diversity that you can find in your backyard, just in a small little place. And because the Forest Department was interested in putting together this documentation, they gave me like access to the area, and me along with another colleague, we went and we looked for spiders, documented them, gave them a report on it. And we also kind of pushed them and encouraged them to put up a lot of these spiders and insect pictures as part of their interpretation center. Because until then it was just, they were just focusing on the large mammals and maybe at the most butterflies. But so for the first time they started putting up, posters on other insect life and spiders. And so they were also interested and excited. And so it was really nice to see that being translated. So using this also, just before I finished my stint at the Center for Indian Resistance, I also was looking at whether we can use spiders in fields where they were trialing out organic cotton farming. So, so to see if certain spiders are found in certain types of farms which are using organic cotton versus farms which were using other, the GM type cotton things. And so that was kind of helpful for the organization as well. So this is almost after 2.5 years, I realized that I needed to try and get a degree in ecology or wildlife. And I soon realized that the Pondicherry University was the only place accessible for someone like me who doesn't have a science background. And so while I remember writing letters to the Wildlife Institute, urging them to kind of reconsider, saying I would write the entrance exam, and even though I don't have a science degree, they'd consider my application. I don't think I ever got a reply. So that was a bit disheartening, but Pondicherry was the only place I could apply. And so I wrote the entrance exam. And I got into the master's program in ecology and environmental sciences, it was called then. So it wasn't really a wildlife program as such, but with more emphasis on ecology and environmental sciences. Again, very much a self-taught course. And it helped me kind of get into a space where I felt that people would be more welcoming if I approached them if I want to get into the field. Because I think until then it was more like, oh, she's just interested in this and she's just interested in that. So while I don't think the course kind of added to my knowledge of ecology as such, and unfortunately it just became a degree at the end of it, it helped me in the sense that, so one thing which helped was the requirement to do a master's thesis as part of this program. And so that kind of helped me focus on a particular topic. And I looked at the relationship between the Jatropha plant and a green-linked spider, because there seemed to be an association between them. And so I was interested in looking at that. So it was very much an ecological study. And so it was also fun to do. It helped that I had a summer internship fellowship between my first year and second year of my master's program at IISc. So I interned with I was doing a summer fellowship program with Dr. Rene Burgess for about 3 months and during the summer time. And this also helped me kind of understand what it meant to be in a scientific institution, how do you actually read and critique a scientific paper, a peer-reviewed paper, actually see how a lab functions. What is it again? And we were looking at the behavior of an ant mimic spider in the lab-like situation. So how do you collect data? And so this helped when I was doing my master's thesis of looking at spiders in the field.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I can relate to many sections of that because as I come from outside the wildlife field as well, and NCBS was one of the few programs I could apply to because I was a former engineer, and I also did a shorter 2-week stint in Rene Borges' lab and got some experience to the field.
Oh, nice.
So,
okay.
Yeah, this is great to hear. But I guess the highlight of this, which many of our listeners would take off, is wait a minute, did she just talk so long about spiders with so much passion and about an egg sac within a spider web, from there all the way up to plant and spider interactions? So may not be people's favorite species of spiders, but I'm sure I can speak for Shikha that it is one of our most interesting and favorite insects. But if you would
not
like
an
to
insect. Not an insect.
I'm sorry. Arachnid. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So yes.
It's all about the number of legs.
Yes. Eight. Too many.
Yes.
So if you could, I guess one thing that would be interesting to chat about is what do you find special about them? So if you have a lay audience who who are open to listening to your spiel about spiders.
So I think there for a lot of people who I've introduced spiders to, they're just when you start talking about them a little bit, it's fascinating in terms of the kind of diversity of spiders that you find around you. In terms of, and when I talk about diversity, I mean just the number of species, but also the different kind of the natural history aspects of this group is so fascinating, in terms of just the different types of webs they build, how they build it. And then there are, there's a large group which doesn't build webs, but in fact, use other methods to hunt for their prey. The fact that many of them have 8 eyes and the way they use their vision to capture their prey, or just the hunting tactics that many of them employ. So just some of those stories to get people to think a little bit more about this group. I find it very useful, and it's for me, I find it, it's lucky that I have so much to share about this group. The fact that, you have such a kind of a range of things to talk about this group of animals. And the fact that just like birds, you can find them anywhere around, whether it's in your house, on the walls of your house, in the little nooks and corners, on a shed, on a wall, under your desk, under a leaf. You keep a few potted plants, and you would find spiders coming to them, on flowers, on all sorts of surfaces. And so you really don't need to go into a forest area to find them. You would really find them anywhere around you. And I've often seen that when you introduce people to a group like spiders and you show them 2 or 3 kinds of spiders and explain a little bit about them in terms of their behavior, in terms of and how you can identify certain groups just by the way they sit or the kind of web that they build, you can see people really starting to get excited and engaged with it. And very much like how it was introduced to me. And so for me, that's a very, I use that as an example to kind of hook people in. And then that's I think 90% of your job is done, right? You just need to introduce people a little bit and hook them a little bit. And then it's up to them in terms of how they want to view this group of animals. They might have a very different way of looking at them, use a very different lens. Unfortunately, even though it's, spiders have become extremely popular in recent times, you find a lot more people looking at them, documenting them. We've, at least in India, we've not yet scratched the surface in terms of doing ecological studies on them as a group, or even behavioral studies. And so people are documenting them, and taxonomy-wise also it's picking up now, but very rarely do you see a lot of information on natural history or behavior or anything else being kind of recorded. And the hope is that some of us who are excited and interested to do this we'll continue doing that for a while and push people to do a little bit more in that area.
So I think, knowing you a little bit, even in terms of how you observe your surroundings on a, like you mentioned, just while walking to office or going for a stroll with some friends for chai, you've got a very, very keen eye, and like not just vision, but even a ear for birds, insects, spiders, all kinds of creatures. And I can only imagine how much more heightened those senses would be if you were in a forest sort of setting. So I think you're a great person to ask, how should one observe their surroundings? What kind of advice would you give people who are interested in looking at what's around them and kind of taking as much of it in as possible?
Ishika, to be honest, I would say it really depends on person to person, and I think it should be organic. So, and not to force yourself to kind of look for things, in a particular way, or say that this is the only way to do it. I would actually tell people to find what hooks them the most. For example, I'm actually terrible with birds and identifying birds. Even though I've been trying my best to do it, somehow I'm just not able to kind of get birds. And a lot of my colleagues are bird crazy people, right? So they find it very hilarious when I still ask them, oh, what's that? Somehow it also doesn't stick when I kind of, when people tell me, oh, this is the species, I know the general group of them. But in terms of actually spotting spiders and insects and other creatures, it really is a little bit of just practice. I get amazed and really, I find it really cool when people identify birds which are just flying around without a pair of binoculars. And I'm like, how did you see that? How are you identifying that? And they say, oh, it's the jizz, right? And so it's the same thing. People ask me when I kind of spot an insect or a spider, which is so beautifully camouflaged. Because I think you get a kind of a vision for it after some point of time. Just look for cues. It can be as subtle as, a random kind of silken thread which you see, and you'll say, hey, okay, maybe if I follow this, I'll find something. And so sometimes it's just that. It's spending time, looking around and what helps is sometimes with the groups of teachers we work with, or even when we take children out for nature walks, or students out for nature walks, I should say, is you can nudge them a little bit to use their different senses. So you tell them, okay, don't just use sight. If you're looking at a plant, try and touch it and feel it and say, okay, what does this feel like? Encouraging them to use their sense of smell. Can they hear anything other than traffic sounds? So getting them to slow down a little bit and getting them to engage with their senses. And again, but that should be organic, I feel. That, people should feel it and feel the need for it. And then it would happen. So, and it really depends on where you are at that point of time as well, right? So in a forest area, of course, your other kinds of senses would be heightened, especially if you know that there are elephants around, for example. I remember the first few times I was in Valpare, and in those areas, you have to take a field assistant with you because there are elephants in a lot of those forest fragments, right? And Akshay knows this, he's worked in that area. I think there is a bit of a fear element as well. So sometimes you may not be engaging with some of your senses as much as you would in your own background in a city-like place, because, there's no danger of sorts there, right? So it really is spending time outdoors and discovering and exploring things for yourself, which will make a huge difference and, get you hooked on to whatever group of animals seem to excite you and interest you. And so it doesn't need to be just spiders or, somebody might just get fascinated by aphids on a plant. And that's enough to kind of open out a whole new world of nature to you. But I would like to encourage your viewers to push that, that sense of wonder and exploration a little bit more, to say, okay, there are aphids on this plant. Why do you think there are aphids? Do all of them look the same? Are there other insects which are also coming towards the aphids? Often I think because of the way we are trained to be in a traditional school system, we forget to ask questions and push ourselves to, to ask questions as to why, what, how. Because we're so used to just receiving information and kind of vomiting it out during the exam time, that I think that sense of exploration and wonder and asking ourselves questions constantly as to why and what is happening, we lose that out. And ecology, I think, is a great subject to help revive that kind of, questioning and pushing yourself to, ask questions and telling yourself that it's okay that you don't have the answers. And this is something we keep telling our teachers, because we train them in an inquiry-based learning thing, that it's okay to tell yourself and the students that you don't know the answer, but let's try and find it out together. There may be an answer somewhere, there may not be an answer to something, but can we, come up with a probable explanation as to why this is happening? Especially in urban India and in our cities, we're so far removed from nature that we have a fixed idea of what nature should be. For example, a lot of people message or write saying that, oh my god, I have aphids, what should I do, should I spray something? And these are people who love organic farming, they buy organic vegetables, they want to have a terrace garden. But any insect, including a caterpillar, so they're not making the association that the beautiful adult butterfly which they see and they say, oh, it's so beautiful and I love butterflies. They don't make the association that there's a caterpillar also there, and that's the caterpillar is what turns into a butterfly. And so the caterpillar needs certain plants to feed on in their garden. Because the automatic reaction of people is to, oh my god, this caterpillar is eating up all my plants, I need to take it out. So we have a huge disconnect in terms of, what is nature to us? And how do we engage with it more meaningfully?
I think you've summed up.
I hope I didn't, give you a very long, windy kind of explanation. Sorry.
No, actually, I think it's so great that you did that, because you also highlighted why we need to, kind of just practice and see what calls out to us and just open our minds and senses to what's around us. Because very often I feel like even if there are people who are interested in seeing wildlife or different non-human creatures, there's not much of a reality connect. Like you mentioned, especially for people in urban, semi-urban areas, we don't really realize what these creatures in our surroundings are actually doing, and the fact that we're all kind of together in an environment. So I think observing is definitely a wonderful way of putting it. And I think it would be so great if we had people such as yourselves or others who kind of encourage us to observe in as many ways as possible. Even through something as simple as a writing workshop. What I've seen is that if you ask somebody, okay, observe the room you're sitting in and write about it, people would just list down what they see. But then when you tell them that observing need not be visual, and you can actually, really tap into every sense that you have and every bit of logic that you have, you can actually draw parallels and connections and make more sense of what's right around you. And that always improves somebody's observation skills and writing. And I think that's also kind of addictive, because the moment you start seeing your world like that, you don't want to stop. And I think that's where the practice and organic connections will come in. So hopefully whoever's listening to this would start opening their eyes in every sense to what's around them.
Including things like, just weeds or grass around you. So a lot of us now start telling people it's okay, let the grass grow, let the weeds grow, it's fine. But our automatic kind of reaction to a lot of this is to pull it out, and then you're losing a whole lot of other organisms which kind of come there and use those species. And because again, we have a very visual kind of understanding or map of how a certain garden should look, how a particular road should look, right? And so I love the fact that the area which I live in is still semi-wild. And so when people say, okay, how do you have so many insects coming to you, or why do so many, how is it that so many birds are coming to you? I live in a 3-floor apartment complex, and yes, a huge reason to attract a lot of wildlife is there is a big pongam tree in front of my apartment, and one of my balconies, the branches come in a little bit, but also because I have random potted plants on my balcony. I've not chosen anything. Whatever people have given me, I've just put on my balcony. But I don't do the clinical cleaning and weeding of these potted plants, right? So I have things growing which were already may have been in the soil, you know, and a lot of people would call them weeds, or, you know, just grass coming up because I'm not, you know, I'm not pulling them out because I don't think it should be there. And as a result of this, all sorts of insects come, you know, because many of them use that as a habitat, as a nesting kind of material. And the complexity that it allows, you know, the fact that there's this different type of vegetation allows it for a complexity of an ecosystem to kind of exist, and therefore attract other things. And you're creating a kind of a home for a lot of these creatures. Yeah, so I think we need to kind of push for that narrative a little bit more, to rethink the way we view nature, you know, and it's often very clinical. And a lot of people have been working on this now in urban spaces, like people like Harini and, you know, Seema, and people have been talking about this quite a bit. But we need to really get it out there to the public, and not just within our own little circles.
This reminds me of this Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where he talks about Theodrus, one of the characters in the book. He talked about how observing, when you ask someone to observe and write about something they can't, then you focus and focus and focus to certain extents where it creates original thought. And in some sense, you encapsulated that idea both from an ecological perspective, from an education perspective, and from a restoration perspective, which is great foreshadowing, because that's what we're going to talk about now. So I think we can start with the restoration perspective, because that seems to be, foreshadowing what would come next. So you have a special connection with spiders, and you use that in some sense to take you to another stage where you can use spiders to understand how forests are coming back, where people with the Nature Conservation Foundation, where you worked with, were bringing back forests, and you were involved in some projects there. So could you tell us a little bit about that, and also tell our listeners maybe potentially how restoration is not the same as tree planting, or how it's different, and how spiders play a role in that?
Okay, thanks, Akshay. I'll just maybe, yeah. So after my master's degree in Pondicherry, I heard about Divyan Shankaraman, who was in Valpare, looking for somebody to help them with their rainforest restoration work, which they had just started at that point of time. I think it was about a year old, their restoration work. And they were looking for somebody to help them with nursery maintenance, the rainforest nursery, which they were kind of starting out, and also to help them with the restoration work in general. And I remember I hadn't had any so-called forest field experience till now. So I kind of jumped at that opportunity. I met them, I spoke to them. And at that point in time, they were only looking for somebody for about 6 months. So they said, let's look at it as a short period of time. And I don't think I even knew what exactly the job entailed. They say I knew it was Western Ghats, it was Valpare, it was rainforest, and I said, okay, this is my time to get some field experience now. I also didn't have any specific kind of research interest to say that, no, I only want to focus on this, or I only want to do that. I was at a stage when I was happy to explore a lot of things. And the fact that there was a nursery being set up, I thought this is a great way for me to get kind of actually do some hands-on work as well. And so when I went to Valpare, my work involved, actually taking care of the nursery, the rainforest restoration nursery, which they just set up. So, and also going and collecting seeds of rainforest species. Now remember, Valpare is a plateau. It's surrounded by the Indira Gandhi Wildlife Sanctuary. And it's a very unique kind of place, because there are these fragments, remnant fragments of rainforests, interspersed between tea and coffee estates. And actually, again, you are familiar with this landscape, so it's pretty unique in the sense that a lot of these rainforest fragments, which are interspersed within the plateau itself, still houses a lot of wildlife. And a lot of people had worked in this landscape looking at, human-elephant interaction or conflict. They also looked at birds, amphibians, and reptiles in this space. So the rainforest restoration work kind of, again, gave me a chance to engage with people like Shankar Raman and Divya, who, had studied this area quite intensively, and had understood the landscape so well, and also how using science and scientific research helps to make informed choices about what needs to be done in terms of a conservation intervention, right? And so that was my first kind of awakening, or my own kind of understanding and learning of how science can be used for conservation practice or intervention. And so that was extremely valuable for me at that point in my career. So to rewind a little bit, so we were collecting rainforest seeds, which we would find along the roadside or in these disturbed forest fragments, bringing them back to the nursery, raising them to a particular kind of age. So, and depending on species, some species would, germinate much faster and grow much faster than other species. We were also doing interesting experiments like collecting seeds from hornbill sites to see if those were kind of, if that was making a difference in terms of the germination rate. And this was a time also where the team in Valpare was engaging much more with the tea estate companies and the coffee companies which were situated there, because it had to be like a collaborative kind of exercise, right? Because some of these fragments were within their estates, and so even though the companies themselves didn't have ownership over those rainforest fragments, it was still situated within their property. So it was also for me interesting to see how getting in other stakeholders into a conservation kind of an intervention program worked. How was a team, engaging with them, seeing things from their perspective as well. So, and not just seeing, of course, we knew what was important and why we needed to do it, but also to understand from their perspective what were their challenges in terms of, doing some of the things that we were recommending that they do. So meeting, people who worked in the tea estate companies as well was very, again, useful for me at that point in my career. So restoration, of course, is different from, I would say, plantation, in the sense that restoration involves understanding what that particular landscape requires, and right, it's to do with the kind of vegetation which is already there. So studying what an intact forest in that particular geographical location is like, what is the complexity of vegetation that's present over there, and only after that, deciding what are the species that require to be planted in a particular area. And even then, each area which you want to restore is so different in terms of the kind of disturbance, which is in that particular area. So, for example, certain plots which we wanted to restore were heavily infested by the lantana, the invasive lantana. And it was not enough to just kind of pull it out. A lot of your listeners would know that lantana is extremely difficult to pull out because they're very deep rooted. So it would involve like continuous removal of lantana in some areas, but that would also mean that a whole area is laid bare, right? So now if you go and put in certain species of rainforest saplings over there, very often they wouldn't survive. because some of these species require a different species to first grow, to allow it to have some shade in a particular area. And I mean, we're not even going to go into the soil complexity, right? Soils may be also so different and so complex. So how do you even, correct for that? But we, Divya and Shankaraman did a few experiments to show that, you require certain species to first be planted in order to give certain areas that particular shade. And only after that can you then start planting other, typical rainforest species, which will, then grow. And a lot of these, so it's a lot of also a trial and error. It also completely depends on elevation in certain areas, certain places, or a slope, so slope, elevation, type of soil, the kind of disturbance, or what, the kind of vegetation which is around. All that makes a huge difference. And I think often when we say tree planting and plantation exercises, don't take this into account. Don't take the complexity of the type of species that is required, the kind of habitat, the type of soil, what is even good for that place. Are there other species which have to first grow in order for different species to then grow along with it? A lot of these things are not taken into account when I think plantation drives are encouraged.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that we've. When I went to Valparai 2 years back, I went in after reading your work and your paper and what Sridhar and Divya have mentioned. And in some sense, it's what you have mentioned is you started off with how you went in there with the fascination for field work, but then you adopted, the scientific way of thinking, but then you ended up with the practice of restoration. Why it's not called the restoration science, but it's a practice where it's a lot of context, local context that has to be incorporated, and how tree planting sort of doesn't, account for that. And I would say the paper that you published with Sridhar and Divya, Shankaraman and Divya, it's an incredible paper because it also shows what didn't work. It shows the failures, which as a lot of science does, it just hides the failures. So I think we'll link that paper in our show notes after the.
Yeah. So while this restoration work was being done, and every year we waited eagerly for the monsoon to hit, because that's the time we would do all our planting. So you have to quickly keep the pits ready, digging up, and getting other people involved, making sure that the weeds are removed, especially lantana is removed, putting up fencing, so coordinating a lot of that. It was lots of fun. But again, with their encouragement, we started discussing how my interest for spiders could also be linked to some of this work. And so we said, okay, no one's really looked at whether spiders can potentially be used as indicator species, right? So you're doing all this restoration work, you're planting, and you have a kind of a control plot to see how your forest, you want your forest to look like after some years. And you have an understanding of bird species in these different types of habitats. Is it possible to maybe, figure out if spiders can be used as an indicator species for some of this work? And so this meant actually then looking at the species diversity in, say, an intact rainforest fragment, which was, which we would keep as our control site, and then look at what are the different spider communities you would find in different types of rainforest fragments, which are under various levels of disturbance. And then see if some of them can be then narrowed down to, in order for us to see if our restoration plots are working or not. And so this was very exciting. So initially what I did was, I wanted to understand first, in this kind of a very complex ecosystem, like rainforests have so many complexities, right? In terms of the species, just the plant species complexity and the diversity and things like that. How does one actually document spiders? So I first started by trying to look at what sampling methods can best be used, right? So I looked at belt transect method. I looked at you putting pitfall traps. I looked at using the usual vegetation beating technique. What is it that's giving me meaningful kind of data? And I realized very soon that for me, in terms of personally and in terms of understanding the system a little bit better, for me, I thought belt transects worked best. And while that meant I would not be able to capture some of the ground dwelling spiders or the nocturnal spiders, or things which are maybe found on higher up in the vegetation, as long as I admitted that I wouldn't be sampling those kind of ecosystems as much, I felt that this would give me a much better understanding and much more fun to document when you're just walking and observing and collecting information. Because I was also keen that I didn't want to collect specimens. I didn't think it was necessary at that point of time for the work that I was doing. And so I stuck to a belt transect method, and I think it worked. I think for me it worked because I was able to do a lot more observations and collect as much natural history information as possible. So along with my field assistant, I would walk into these different forest fragments, document the kind of species I would find. And I think I did this for about 8 months. So it spanned over 2 seasons. And I indeed found, and I've written, I have a paper on this. I indeed found that there are certain species which seem to be completely absent in very disturbed rainforest fragments. You would just not find that group of spiders. The reverse was also true, that there are certain species which I would find only in extremely disturbed fragments. And so the presence of these species, can they be used for the rainforest restoration work that we will be doing? And I'm hoping that at some point in the near future, either I could go back and relook, to see some of these fragments which have been restored, to see if some species have come back or not, or if somebody else, could actually take this study forward. It will be really nice, because we have so much more information on spider species now, because lots more people are looking into it. So there's a better documentation. So I used morphological kind of features and other kind of natural history information to kind of club them into a family or a genus, and in some cases a species. And if I couldn't identify something, I would just describe it and leave it as that. And I was actually quite happy with that, without having to stress about getting into a species kind of a description. And so some of my colleagues who were looking at spiders, with a taxonomic lens, would sometimes curse me, because I would send them pictures or describe a particular spider, and they're like, "Man, this seems like it's a new species. Why didn't you collect it?" And I said, "But what if it's only 1 or 2 individuals left? I don't want to collect that, So there was a little bit of tension and stress that I wasn't collecting, but I was very happy. So, and a year later, ATRI had this small grants program, and I'd applied for that. And so I got a small grant of 50,000 rupees, which allowed me to call a wildlife photographer, Sarah, who's also a very good friend, Saravana Kumar, to come and help me document some of these spider species, because we didn't have any photographic documentation of this. And I thought it would be really nice to, add value to the study, so that, people, so I could say that this particular species, it can be used as an indicator of a good forest. And this particular species can be used as an indicator for a forest that is disturbed. But I think it'll be so much more valuable if you have, a photograph attached to a particular species as well. So we went and did some documentation work about a year after that. And because of that documentation work, and because of that small grant from ATRI, those are the pictures I use for all my spider talks now, when which I give to people. So it really turned out nicely.
So it's, I think it's very interesting that you've done so much field work, and you've also kind of approached that field work from a practical standpoint and a scientific standpoint. And like Akshay mentioned, it is more about the practice of doing things. And after doing all of that and seeing what an NGO's work is like on ground, you ended up working quite heavily on the management side of things and the administration side of things for Nature Conservation Foundation when you shifted to Mysore. And you were very closely linked to developing their PhD program. You did a lot of fundraising for them. You managed their budgets. And I think you're probably, because of all of that, the best person to tell our listeners what it's actually like to run a small NGO, and what your field experience brought to that administrative role as well. Because I think when you are handling the management side of things in an NGO, it's important to be well connected with the work that's going on ground, and to know what kind of support an NGO needs to provide to its researchers and practitioners. So what is that like for you?
I think it also brings in the element of empathy, right? Because you've kind of worked in a situation where you've been a student and you've been a assistant or a researcher. And so you have then communicated with the head office back in Mysore, and wanting some kind of support. So you know what it is like to be on the other side. Yeah. So when I got into a more administrative kind of position in NCF, and again, this was not a conscious choice. I'd like to lay that out. Okay, at that point of time, when I came back from Valparai, I was there for more than 3.5 years. I think I wanted to come back to kind of assess what I wanted to do next in my career. I was still confused at that point of time. It's also a field and an organization that a lot of people, the kind of automatic career progression is to do a PhD. And I was still not keen to do a PhD at that point of time, because I felt that I wasn't suited for a PhD kind of program in the way I was seeing, how people were doing it. And some of it may have come from a lack of confidence as well, because I don't have that kind of science background. It may have come from that lack of confidence. And I felt that you need to really focus on one particular topic if you want to do a PhD. And I didn't think I was suited for that kind of a narrow definition of research. And so it really just also happened that NCF was looking for someone to help them with the admin side of things. And so, and I wasn't averse to helping out at that point of time. And so I kind of just jumped into it. And it was interesting because NCF was still a small organization at that point of time still, right? There were very few people. So when I joined, in fact, there were just about 10 of us, 15 of us. When I first joined the Valparai program. And when I came to Mysore, of course, it was about 30, 40, 50 people. And so it was interesting to also see the organization going through these changes in terms of number of people coming in. And as an organization, we were also thinking about starting this PhD program. So conversations about that had started. And just in terms of supporting people across the different programs. So NCF, as you know, is like a very federal kind of a structured organization, right? Each program is very independent of the other. And so all the programs come under the NCF umbrella, the Nature Conservation Foundation umbrella. Each program very independent, even in terms of geographical locations, right? And the kind of research each of these programs do is very different in the way they approach it. So just helping different programs with whatever requirements they had, including also the fundraising for the institution, because while programs were able to raise money for their own projects, the institution itself, we had to raise money in order to get other things moving and functioning, and creating a kind of a pool of funding for the institution as a whole. So I was in the admin side of the organization during the time it was transitioning into a larger organization. So it was very interesting to see that. And because I dabbled a little bit in, in the Center for Nervous Systems as well, I, would have long conversations with my boss at that point of time in terms of people management, or, how do you kind of motivate people? And this is, again, based on personal experience, and also kind of reflecting a little bit on, how each of us kind of interact with each other. And I found that as a field, we don't take this seriously enough, just working with a team of people, because I think for many people who are in the research field, it's a very individualistic pursuit, right? That's how research is usually kind of designed in such a way that it's a bit individualistic, and a PhD especially is extremely individualistic. So we forget what it means to work with a group of people often, what it means to be on the other side when say you are the boss of somebody. And so I think as a field, we're still not taking this seriously enough. And we really need to push for organizations and small groups of people to think of, training people or having more open, honest conversations about working in teams. What's the best way to kind of approach a particular problem, or if this happens, how can you kind of make course corrections and things like that. So in fact, for the last few years, I offer a workshop on managing people and teams during SCCS, during the student conference in conservation science. And so I use a lot of case studies from the conservation field to highlight certain issues of, problems that you would, be faced with when you're working with teams of people. Or including things like, if you have a boss who is a micromanager, how do you deal with a situation like that, right? So you use case studies to try and kind of break up how you would have a conversation. Often we also don't know how to say no, right? When something comes up, somebody tells you, okay, can you do this? We hesitate to say no. So how do you say no in a way that is, self-defeating, or you feel bad, or the person who's receiving it feels bad. So again, there's no kind of ready-made kind of toolkit, I would say, in terms of how do you manage an organization, because it really depends on the kind of people who are part of it. It depends on the size of the organization. So like I was saying, NCF started from a very small organization, and so a lot of it was just organic. We never had formal systems in place for the longest of time, right? So we still don't have, say, a person who dons the role of a HR manager, for example, which a lot of large organizations have. But as you grow larger and larger, you need to decide for yourself as an organization or as a group of people whether you need to have systems in place. Because, especially if you are in an organization for many years, you understand how you can navigate working within the organization and with people, right? And you also have very personal connections with people when you work with them for many years. But to remind yourself that other people who come from outside and join your organization may not have the luxury of time or that personal connection with other people. And so then asking yourself whether you need to then start putting systems in place where you can formalize things a little bit more, right? So if somebody has an issue with the person or the way a particular kind of issue is being handled by the organization, do they have recourse to that, right? And what's the best way to do it without having a conflict of interest? And we're such a small community of people, everyone knows everybody else. And so it becomes even more important to be sensitive to the fact that, there's so much of conflict of interest, which is possible. So how best to kind of cushion that and just make it a more welcoming workspace, so that people don't have to resort to personal kind of connections in order to get things to work. So when I first got to the admin side of things, it helped that I had a little bit of time to work on a activity book for students in Arunachal Pradesh along with Aparajita. So that was nice because I wasn't only doing a lot of the admin work. I also had a little bit of a time to kind of help put together this activity book. And so it, gave me that time and space to think about what I want to do next as well.
Now, I think you've mentioned some very important points, and one of which I'd like to highlight is the importance of taking some time off for yourself, and not just going on this conveyor belt sort of a pattern, which many Indians I know do, where from 10th you go to 12th, you go to undergrad, masters, immediately PhD, and, without really stopping to breathe and trying to figure out what you want to do. And we see so many people shifting gears completely in their postdocs and things like that because they've never had the time to breathe and really just take stock of what they wanted to do. And I think what's very interesting about your entire journey is that you've given yourself those pockets of time and reassessment and evaluation to say, okay, at this point, how do I proceed? And I think many people also don't do it because, especially when you're younger, a lot of these decisions aren't entirely your own. And sometimes maybe your family is really worried about letting you take a break.
Yeah.
So I think that's, you very nicely with a bunch of examples told us how that can really help you as a person.
I
And
just wanted to also add that it also helps to have an organization which is very supportive of these different paths that I've taken within NCF as well. So it really helped that they were willing to place their bets on me, right? So they needn't have, for example, given me an opportunity to help with the admin side of things because I had zero experience till then, in terms of helping with administration and finance. But so sometimes it really, really helps to have very supportive colleagues and the organization itself that kind of places their bets on you and really encourages you to kind of find your way and path as well. So that really helps. And also, but having said that, also I had the privilege to be able to take that step back and allow myself these different kind of exploratory phases because again, parents were quite okay in terms of being hands off in my career choices. Yes, money was tight for a very, very long time. I had zero savings. But again, this is where organizational help and support comes, right? So when I moved to Mysore, my salary really wasn't enough for me to be able to rent a place and stay. I would have lost a huge chunk of my salary on rent. But the fact that they had a guest house which I had access to and I could stay meant that I didn't have to spend money on renting out a place for myself. And again, all these became useful for me to kind of be a little bit less stressed about engaging with this type of a career shift. So it's important to also tell yourself that that yes, some people have to take a particular traditional career path, but when you see and read about or hear about other people taking extremely unconventional paths as well, sometimes there's a whole lot of reasons which has allowed them to take those unconventional career choices, and to tell yourself that if you can't do that, it's okay not to beat yourself over that. So I was, in that sense, I don't want to use the word lucky, but because sometimes that's also sometimes puts down the set of circumstances which kind of leads you to where you are, but it is a whole supporting environment which allows you to be able to dabble in different things.
Yeah, and I think I just a little earlier part of what you were mentioning about working in teams, and some things that really struck out to me was how academics don't really make for good team managers unless you train them, right? And that's not what they're trained to do, like you mentioned, and how your challenge was to create these structures even when people are not sort of averse to that. And that leads me to my next question, which actually builds off of your MPhil work and what you did afterwards. So after your work with Administration NCF, you went to Cambridge to do an MPhil in conservation. Correct me if I'm wrong. And immediately after that, you worked on a very interesting problem. So I think our listeners would be really fascinated because that sort of codifies, in some sense, your learnings from both ecology, from working on a smaller scale with more informal groups, as well as formally with an NGO. Which is, how is it that conservation organizations, like say different organizations that are located close to each other, improve their net sort of output by collaborating? So can you talk us through that? Like, what makes a good collaboration? What makes a bad collaboration? And what exactly did you do?
Okay. So until 2010, I didn't have any kind of ideas in terms of studying more. Little bit about whether I should do a PhD. The idea used to keep popping in and out again because I was surrounded by all the PhDs around me. But it just so happened, again, I would use the word serendipitous, that Cambridge came up with a new course called an MPhil in Conservation Leadership. The kind of the way that the course was advertised and the kind of people they were looking for really fit into the kind of profile which I had at that point of time. So they were looking for people who had at least 3 to 5 years of experience in the conservation field, and they were calling it an interdisciplinary course, right? So now again, remember that my conservation kind of experience only came from Valparai till then. and from being within an organization like Nature Conservation Foundation, which is a conservation organization, right? So conversations with people and just understanding and reading about the research that different people are doing and things like that. So I thought this was a great opportunity for me to actually see if I wanted to take a break from the administration and running the organization to actually get back into the academics a little bit. But this course was very attractive because there was not a very strong emphasis on the academic side of things. So it was a course which said that they would dabble across different disciplines, and that there was a management aspect to the course as well. So a lot of different departments within Cambridge would be teaching us different courses. So that was very attractive. That year also, again, luckily for me, the Ravi Shankaran INLAC scholarship opportunity came up. And so I applied for that. And so because I got the scholarship, I also got admission into the Cambridge course. And ours was the first batch. So this really gave me an opportunity to kind of step back and dive into current conservation literature and research which was going on, and also look at conservation from a worldview lens, right? Because Cambridge and the course attracted people from across the world. And so that was a huge learning for me. And it was the first time I was dabbling in the more social sciences kind of discipline as well. It was really useful that the course was housed in the geography department. And so I was kind of privy to a lot of critiques of conservation which were happening at that point of time. So while we were studying and learning and having to write essays about payment for ecosystem services, or the RED and RED Plus kind of discourse and debates that were going on, the fact that we were also in the geography department and being taught by geographers also meant that we were critiquing a lot of these current conservation kind of approaches. And because the way the course was structured, we had to write essays throughout the year. So again, that was a bit stressful for me because now I was away from academics for more than 10 years. And again, being in an Indian kind of a system where we're so used to writing answers to questions and being only kind of trained in receiving information, this was a completely new learning experience for me, right? To be able to ask questions in class, to be able to push back, to be able to debate with each other. So all of it was completely new and fascinating for me. And also to train yourself to write an essay. I had never written a proper academic essay till then. So while it was stressful, it was hugely beneficial to go through that training and to kind of get in touch with current conservation discourse. And part of this course involved having to do what they were calling an internship with a conservation organization there. Now, the course itself came about as a result of different conservation organizations that were in Cambridge, talking about how useful it will be to have a more practical kind of conservation course. And they were calling it a conservation leadership course. And so the course itself was a result of people from different conservation organizations coming together and designing what they thought was an ideal conservation leadership course to offer to students from across the world. And so initially it was not thought of as a course which would be housed in the University of Cambridge, but then they thought that it would attract a lot of people, and the fact logistically it made much more sense to house it within a university setup. So this course required us to do an internship with one of the Cambridge conservation organizations which were part of this collaboration. And so again, so I ended up interning, and again this was through a mixture of me showing interest in the conservation organization as well as being interviewed for the position and things like that. I ended up working for the collaborative initiative that was facilitating the collaboration of the different conservation organizations that were in and around Cambridge as a city. And so this collaborative initiative, it's called the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, was set up after a bunch of conservation organizations were loosely kind of, collaborating on various things earlier, not formally, but they had set up something called a Cambridge Conservation Forum, where they would meet once in a while as individuals or as organizations. They would, organize talks or short workshops, or even as a social gathering. During winter, they would, plan a nature walk somewhere, or they would plan a Christmas party where people who are, working within the different conservation organizations come together socially. So after a few years, many of the heads of these organizations thought, why don't they formalize this kind of, loose collaboration which was happening, and actually think seriously about, collaborating much more formally in research, in policy, in practice, and to also apply for funding as a group of organizations, right? And the only way that would happen is that you have to have a separate kind of neutral facilitating organization and an individual to facilitate for this collaboration to happen. And so they floated, an organization, or what they were calling collaborative initiative, called the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And they put one person in charge of that, who would act as a neutral facilitator for this collaboration. And that was very important, because this person didn't represent any one conservation organization as such, right? This person was seen as the person who was working for the collaboration as a whole, and was also seen as a person who wanted the collaboration to kind of succeed and not just individual organizations, and to ease up the tensions in terms of if different conservation organizations were having to compete for the same funding pool, for example, how best to not allow for those tensions to come up. So, so as a student having to do an internship, the person who was heading this collaborative initiative wanted to kind of understand how this collaboration is working so far. So now the initiative was set up for about 4 or 5 years till then. How is it going for different people? Because he knew that him asking the partners, he may not get, open, very kind of honest possible answers. And so a student going and interviewing these partner organizations to see whether such a collaborative initiative is working or not, how can it be improved, what are the challenges that they see going ahead, and things like that. So part of my internship was to interview each of these conservation organizations, the heads of these conservation organizations, to ask them how they thought the initiative is working. What are the challenges that they were seeing is coming up as being part of a collaboration? What are the tensions? And there were a lot of tensions also, right? Because a lot of people felt that they were not making as much impact in the policy arena, for example. That was one of the main things in order to come together as a collaborative. They felt that that was not being fulfilled. But what was really helping the collaboration function well, and a lot of people were appreciative towards, was that there was the initiative had set up something called a collaborative fund, which different organizations could come together and apply for. And there was a requirement that at least 2 or more conservation organizations and 1 university department has to collaborate in order to apply for that funding pool. So there was this common funding pool available for people to come together, write up joint proposals together and apply for that. And they said that was really pushing people to kind of, collaborate. And they said they felt that even though it may seem like it's a forced collaboration, the fact that people knew each other from earlier, and that there was a social capital already built from their earlier kind of thing, that kind of helped, make this collaboration much better. And this is where I think Cambridge kind of, the Cambridge collaboration seems to be working compared to other organizations in other countries, which kind of came together after they had an injection of funds, which was given to them. And so in some sense, it was a forced collaboration on them. And so my study was also trying to understand some of these dynamics of what seems to be working when you come together as a collaboration or not. And I used a little bit of business theory to kind of understand why, how organizations or companies were using this concept called clustering, geographical clustering, in order to improve their impact. And so business theory talks about how different companies cluster together, right? So for example, if you go to a city, in some places there are these roads which are dedicated with just steel shops, right? Or just gold shops. And intuitively you would think, why are such similar shops all together? It doesn't make sense, right? Because then you're competing with each other. But business theory says that actually this is a good way to increase competition. The fact that such similar companies and kind of goods and services, shops are together, it means that you're competing with each other, and so your ability to make better goods and services increases. The fact that you're all in one geographical location together means that you're attracting a certain talent pool to that place, right? Why is Bangalore an IT hub? Why it's called an IT cluster hub, right? It's because there's so many IT companies in one geographical locality. There's more of a chance that you would get people who are trained in a particular discipline to be attracted to a particular place. And so I use this geographical clustering theory in business to see if conservation organizations are using their geographical proximity, and in this case, Cambridge, to collaborate more, right? So it's different from the competition. It's to collaborate more, and how are they doing that? And as part of my MPhil thesis, I also had to tell the Cambridge Conservation Initiative how they could improve their collaborative potential based on what partners were telling me, right? And so they used a lot of my recommendations in order to plan out their next 10 years of strategic planning exercise. And I saw this through, and that was a very interesting and fascinating kind of experience for me, because I saw my work getting translated into something which the organization was using at that point of time. So that was it was very nice to see that being translated. And so, so I presented this work in one of the SCCS Bangalore kind of conferences. And at that point of time, we were also discussing whether we can bring such a model into a city like Bangalore, because we have so many conservation organizations in one geographical locality, right? And a lot of people at that point in time, when I spoke to them, said they're not ready. And for me, that was an interesting thing, because people felt that unfortunately our conservation community, and if I can be candid about this, is very much personality driven, right, still. And so people would find it very difficult to be open to the idea of such an open collaboration. And Ishika and I have spoken a little bit about this, even when we're trying to get people together for workshops and things like that. We're still not used to it, but it's really heartening to see that some of it is organically happening now. Like, for example, I think the Bird Count India collaboration is a nice example of how organizations are coming together, for a citizen science kind of project. And SCCS, the student conference in Bangalore, is a nice example of a collaboration happening between organizations. But we are still not there yet in terms of being open to collaborating for making an impact on policy, for example, or just doing joint research. And I see a lot of potential for that. And I'm hoping that the next generation of conservation people are a little bit more open to this idea of actually getting together and collaborating for a meaningful impact, and not just for the sake of being able to apply for a funding pool or for a funding proposal.
Yeah. And this is all, it's so fascinating, because Ishika and I are just, young budding ecologists. We don't have that much experience, but whatever snatches of information that we have collected and gathered so far from this community, both of us study in Bangalore and work with the NGO space in Bangalore, is this potential that you describe. And it's amazing how your work in Cambridge gives you such amazing insight into one is the whole cradle to grave insight that we are so envious that you could actually see that with a project of yours, because most people don't get to see it. So because you did that, I'm going to put you in a spot and say, okay, today you have infinite funding and infinite resources. If there's one thing you would do to improve collaborative research and conservation action and environment education in, say, let's say the Bangalore cluster or the Delhi cluster for in our field, what would it be?
So I didn't really understand that question. You're asking me what I would do at this point in order to improve conservation impact within the Bangalore sector. Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't clear. What I meant was you gave the benefits of a geographic co-location, right?
Yes,
and how organizations are close to each other and the benefits of that. And you mentioned that Bangalore is a potential in some sense for all these NGOs and institutions together. And there are many such nodes in India, right? So, and you also mentioned how a lot of it is personality driven and how those constrained how these kind of collaborations are possible, and how even if they are collaborating, it's only for the fund and not to create the greater impact. So in a hypothetical scenario, what would you say is the silver bullet, if there is one, to fix this problem, or the weakest link that you would then fix to make it better?
I think one would be, and again, it may come across as being naive when I say this, is to leave behind past baggage. With a lot of us carry in terms of how our interactions with each other are, and so if that's possible, and to actually come together as a community and be very open to not only collaborating between different organizations and people, but being very open to collaborating with different disciplines. Again, I'm seeing that slowly kind of changing now. People are much more open to engaging with the social sciences much more. But I still think we're at the surface still. We're just scratching, right? I don't think we're as open to multidisciplinary kind of ways of looking at conservation. And I'm hoping that this will change much more. So allowing for that space and for honest conversations to take place, and allowing for the next generation to have a voice. I still think we rely too much on the older generation folk who head organizations for their point of view, and often we still see them kind of being in the spotlight for everything. I think people and organizations should now start allowing for a next generation who seems to be much more kind of tuned into collaborating much more. Or even Cafe Oikos is an example of that. You have people from different organizations coming together to give such a fascinating kind of platform for to the general public, but allowing for those voices and spaces to take place. But I really think that there is a huge potential for a neutral facilitating kind of a body, like how the Cambridge Conservation Initiative has been set up, to have something like that in Bangalore to start with, because there are so many conservation organizations. We're all geographically co-located. I think there is potential. It doesn't have to replicate the model of Cambridge, but to be open to the idea of such a possibility, I think will be really nice. And we should have a small community of people, I think, who are bought into the idea. I was a bit disappointed when I came and proposed that we try and have this conversation and try and push this idea. People said, yeah, I think it might work, but I don't think it'll work in Bangalore. We're not yet ready for something like that. People in Cambridge seem to be, much more open, and they have the setup there. I don't think we would be. So that was for me a little bit disappointing. And I think many of us don't have the kind of clout as yet in the conservation community to have much of a powerful voice. So if we have the kind of bigwigs pushing for it, I think it might get some traction. So that would be my wish and hope, that we would actually start, honestly and, trying much more to have conversations across different organizations and across disciplines.
Yeah, and maybe like you said, either the big wigs push for it, or the big wigs push themselves out to make way for the new batch.
To the new batch, yeah. So it's nice that, I can see a lot more people critiquing current conservation discourse, right, even in our country. And I really think that it's good that, there are different viewpoints coming out. And so it might be, while it might be confusing for people who are not in the conservation sector to hear all these differing kind of points of views of how conservation should be done in our country or not, I think for the conservation community, it's very healthy to critique ourselves constantly about the work that we're doing, the research we are doing, and I think that's a very important thing. And for a long time, we didn't have that, the space or the confidence to be able to do that. But because now more people are coming forward and saying, no, this is not the way to do conservation anymore. The traditional way is not working, and we have to listen to anthropologists, to social scientists, to economists, to whatever, and we have to kind of see how we can embrace some of what those disciplines are telling us, and not blindly, of course, embrace it and copy it, but see what works in our situation and in our space.
So I'm also going to, build on what you just said to talk a little more about, the role I know you best in as an environmental educator, where you've gotten into a very interdisciplinary space of conservation. And like you said, it is important that we start acknowledging the importance of those other ways of doing conservation. And it's not just about looking at wild animals anymore. And I think it's good that that is coming about, because conservation, especially in India, as a field, it's still pretty young. So what we call traditional methods are not really that old, or don't go back that far. It's just how we originally did it. So it would be interesting to see how this unfolds in time, and hopefully, uh, you know, Akshay peers and my peers can also bring more of this interdisciplinarity to the field as we explore our careers going forward. And of course, everyone else who may be listening who's just figuring out whether they even like the idea of conservation. Akshay and I are only halfway through deconstructing Vena's fascinating journey in conservation. Tune in to part 2, where we continue our conversation by tracing Vena's foray into the world of nature education. Thanks for listening.